Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Deception. Dean Duran stood in the mirror of his penthouse bathroom, adjusting his tie with the precision of a man who had built his life on control. At 35, he was a name partner at Barrett & Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his suit hand-tailored, and his steel-gray eyes reflected the calculating mind that had never lost a case. But tonight, those eyes held something different, a flicker of anticipation that his wife Judy would have recognized as dangerous, had she been paying attention. Judy Duran née Morton sat at her vanity, applying lipstick with trembling hands. At 28, she had transformed from the humble daughter of Stan Morton into the polished wife of a successful attorney. Her auburn hair cascaded in perfect waves, her emerald dress cost more than her father made in 3 months, and her diamond necklace caught the light like fracture promises. She checked her phone for the 15th time in 10 minutes, her breath catching when she saw no new messages. "Ready for your father's graduation party?" Dean's voice carried its usual warmth, but Judy caught the undertone she'd learned to fear, the same tone he used in court when he was about to destroy an opponent. "Of course," she replied, forcing a smile, "though I still think we should have hosted it ourselves. Dad would have been more comfortable." Dean's reflection smiled back at her, and for a moment, Judy saw the man she'd fallen in love with 5 years ago. The man who had swept her off her feet when she was working as a paralegal at his firm, who had promised to love her father as his own. That man had died somewhere between their second anniversary and her first affair. "Your father deserves to be celebrated properly," Dean said, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. "Besides, my parents insisted on hosting. They were so excited to finally meet the man who raised such an accomplished daughter." Judy's stomach clenched. Dean's parents, Arthur and Rita Duran, were old Chicago money, the kind of people who donated wings to hospitals and had their names engraved on library foundations. They had never approved of their son's marriage to that Morton girl, though they'd been polite enough to her face. The thought of her father, Stan, in his best thrift store suit, trying to make conversation with people who saw him as beneath their notice, made her sick. Stan Morton had raised Judy alone after her mother died when she was 7. He'd worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, washing dishes at a diner during the day, and doing maintenance at a local church on weekends, to put her through college. His hands were permanently stained from industrial cleaners, his back curved from years of bending over toilets and sinks, but his pride in his daughter burned brighter than the North Star. As their car pulled up to the Duran estate in Lincoln Park, Judy's phone buzzed. Her heart hammered as she saw the name on the screen, Gabriel Barrett. "Missing you tonight. Wish I could be there to support you." She deleted the message quickly, but not before Dean's eyes flicked to her phone. His expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. Gabriel Barrett was Dean's law partner, 15 years his senior and twice as ruthless. Where Dean was precision and control, Gabriel was charm and manipulation. He had silver hair, a warm smile, and the ability to make anyone feel like the most important person in the room. He'd been making Judy feel that way for the past 8 months, ever since Dean had started working 18-hour days on the Hartwell merger. The affair had started innocently enough. Late nights at the office, Gabriel offering comfort when Dean was too busy to notice Judy's loneliness. Gabriel listened when Dean didn't, held her when Dean was too tired, and made her feel desired when her husband treated her like an accessory to his success. What Judy didn't know was that Gabriel Barrett was a man who collected trophies, and stealing his partner's wife was just another conquest to him. What she also didn't know was that Dean had known about the affair for 3 months, having installed monitoring software on her phone after noticing her changed behavior. Every text, every call, every secret meeting had been documented with the thoroughness of a man who built court cases for a living. The Duran estate sprawled across 2 acres, its Tudor revival architecture a testament to 4 generations of accumulated wealth. Inside, the party was already in full swing. Chicago's legal elite mingled with local politicians and business leaders, all gathered ostensibly to celebrate Stan Morton's graduation from community college at age 55, an achievement that had taken him 7 years of night classes while working full-time. Stan stood near the appetizer table, looking overwhelmed in his ill-fitting suit. His weathered hands clutched a glass of champagne like a lifeline, and his eyes darted around the room as if expecting someone to ask him to leave. He'd never been in a house this grand, never been surrounded by this level of wealth and education. Arthur Duran approached Stan with the casual arrogance of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. At 62, he was still imposing, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that commanded boardrooms and country clubs. "So you're Stan," Arthur said, his tone carrying the weight of judgment. "The famous toilet cleaner dad we've heard so much about." Stan's face flushed red, but he extended his hand. "Stan Morton, sir. Thank you for hosting this party for me." Arthur looked at the offered hand with barely concealed disgust. "Yes, well, one does what one must for family." He accepted the handshake briefly, then immediately reached for his pocket square to wipe his fingers. Rita Duran materialized beside her husband, her smile sharp as a blade. At 58, she was still beautiful in the way that money and maintenance could preserve, but her eyes were cold as winter mornings. "Oh my," she said, her voice carrying perfectly across the nearby conversations. "Are you the toilet cleaner dad we heard about? How quaint." The conversations around them began to die as people turned to watch the exchange. Stan's shoulders straightened, his pride warring with his embarrassment. "I'm proud of my work, ma'am," he said quietly. "Honest work that put my daughter through college and law school." Arthur chuckled, the sound like glass breaking. "Yes, cleaning toilets. Very noble. I suppose we all contribute to society in our own small ways." He turned to a nearby group of lawyers. "Gentlemen, let me introduce Stan Morton. He's an expert in sanitation management." The laughter that followed was polite but cutting. Stan's face went pale, and he stepped back as if physically struck. "Dad." Judy appeared at his elbow, her face flushed with shame and anger. But her anger wasn't directed at the Durans. It was directed at her father for being exactly what he was, for not being something more presentable. "Maybe you should go home," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of a lifetime of embarrassment. "You look tired." Stan stared at his daughter, the little girl he'd raised, the woman he'd sacrificed everything for, and saw the truth in her eyes. She was ashamed of him. In this moment, surrounded by her new life and new family, he was nothing but an embarrassment. "Of course," he said, his voice steady despite the devastation in his eyes. "I should go." Dean watched this exchange from across the room, his expression unreadable. But inside, something cold and furious was building. Not because he cared particularly about Stan Morton, though he respected the man's sacrifices, but because his wife had just revealed the depth of her character. The woman he'd married, the woman he'd built a life with, was capable of betraying the person who loved her most. As Stan left the party, walking alone to his 15-year-old Honda Civic while the elite of Chicago continued their celebration, Dean made a decision. If Judy could betray her own father, the man who had given her everything, then her betrayal of their marriage was just another data point in a pattern. And patterns, Dean knew, could be predicted, manipulated, and ultimately destroyed. Judy returned to his side, her face composed but her hands shaking slightly. "He understood," she said, as if trying to convince herself. "He knows this isn't his world." Dean smiled and pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You did the right thing," he murmured, the lies sliding off his tongue as smoothly as honey. "Sometimes we have to make difficult choices to protect the people we love." But as he held his wife, Dean was already planning. Arthur and Rita Duran had shown their true colors tonight, revealing the cruelty that lay beneath their polished exterior. Judy had chosen shame over loyalty. And somewhere across town, Gabriel Barrett was probably waiting for a text from Judy, ready to offer comfort that Dean would never give again. They had all made their choices. Now Dean would make his. Chapter 2. The architecture of revenge. Dean's law office occupied the corner of the 40th floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Lake Michigan. The morning after the graduation party, he sat behind his mahogany desk, fingers steepled, studying the surveillance photos spread before him like evidence in a murder trial. Gabriel Barrett entering the Fairmont Hotel. Judy's car in the parking garage. Timestamps that coincided perfectly with her claimed girls' nights and shopping trips. Dean had enough evidence to destroy both their reputations and careers, but simple exposure wasn't enough. Not after what he'd witnessed at the party. A knock interrupted his planning. "Come in." Kelvin Riley entered, carrying a thick folder. At 42, Kelvin was Dean's private investigator, a former Chicago PD detective who'd found more lucrative work in the private sector. His weathered face and graying temples spoke to years of seeing the worst in people, but his loyalty to Dean was absolute. "Everything you requested," Kelvin said, placing the folder on the desk. Stan Morton's background, financial records, employment history. The man's clean as a whistle. No criminal record, no debts beyond normal living expenses, tax returns filed every year since he was 18. Dean opened the folder, scanning the meticulously detailed life of Stan Morton. Born into poverty, mother died when he was 12, father abandoned the family. Dropped out of high school to work, later got his GED. Married Sarah Nichols at 22, had Judy 2 years later. Wife died of cancer when Judy was 7. Medical bills that would have crushed most families, but Stan paid every penny. "Look at this," Kelvin continued, pointing to a bank statement. "Every month for the past 7 years, he's been putting money aside for Judy's graduation party. $15 here, $20 there. He saved $3,000 to celebrate her achievement." Dean's jaw tightened. Stan Morton had scraped together money. He couldn't afford to celebrate a daughter who was ashamed of him. Meanwhile, that same daughter was spending more than that on a single dress to impress her lover. "What about Gabriel Barrett?" Dean asked. Kelvin's expression darkened. "Now, there's a different story. Born Gabriel Barrett Sinclair, dropped the last name when he moved to Chicago 15 years ago. Had a law practice in Seattle that ended badly. Accusations of client fraud, attorney misconduct. Nothing proved, but enough smoke to suggest fire. Interesting. And his personal life? Divorced 3 times. 2 ended with restraining orders. Current girlfriend is Celeste Poole, a paralegal at Morrison & Associates. She doesn't know about your wife." Dean absorbed this information, his mind already working through possibilities. Gabriel wasn't just a predator. He was a serial predator with a history of manipulation and abuse. Judy was just his latest victim, but she was also complicit in her own betrayal. "I need you to do something else," Dean said. "I want you to approach Stan Morton. Tell him you're a journalist writing a story about a dull education, about people who overcome obstacles to achieve their dreams. Make him feel important, valued. Get him to trust you." Kelvin frowned. "What's the play here, Dean?" "Stan Morton is going to help me destroy everyone who humiliated him last night. He just doesn't know it yet." That afternoon, Dean returned to his Lincoln Park mansion, the house he'd bought for Judy, filled with art she'd chosen and furniture she'd selected. Every room was a testament to their shared life, their shared dreams. Soon, it would be a mausoleum to their marriage. Judy was in the kitchen, making her famous lemon chicken, the dish she always prepared when she felt guilty about something. She looked up as he entered, her smile nervous and bright. "I thought I'd make your favorite," she said, her voice artificially cheerful. "Last night was intense." Dean moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and nuzzling her neck. She relaxed into his embrace, and he felt the familiar surge of desire mixed now with something darker, the thrill of the hunt. "You handled it perfectly," he murmured against her skin. "I know it wasn't easy." Judy leaned back against him, tears starting to form. "I felt terrible about Dad. The way your parents talked to him, the way I... God, Dean, what kind of person am I?" "You're a person who's grown beyond her circumstances," Dean said, his voice gentle and understanding. "Your father raised you to be more than he was. You honored his sacrifice by becoming someone who belongs in our world." It was exactly what she needed to hear, and Dean watched her shoulders relax as she accepted his absolution. Judy had always needed someone to tell her she was good, that her choices were justified. First her father, then Dean, now Gabriel. She collected validations like others collected coins. "I love you," she whispered, turning in his arms. "I love you too," he replied, and the lie felt like acid on his tongue. That evening, while Judy attended what she claimed was a book club meeting, Dean sat in his study, planning. The revenge he envisioned wouldn't be quick or simple. It would be elaborate, methodical, and absolutely devastating. Gabriel Barrett would lose everything he'd built, his reputation destroyed so thoroughly that no firm would ever hire him again. Arthur and Rita Duran would discover that their social standing meant nothing when faced with public humiliation and financial ruin. But Judy's punishment would be the most exquisite of all, because Dean understood that what Judy feared most wasn't losing her marriage. It was losing her status, her security, her place in the world she'd clawed her way into. He would strip all of that away, piece by piece, until she was left with nothing but the truth of what she really was. His phone buzzed with a text from Kelvin, met with Stan Morton. He's devastated but hopeful. Believes the journalist's story completely. He's ready to talk about his daughter's success and how proud he is of her achievements. Perfect. Stan Morton's love for his daughter would be the weapon Dean used to destroy her. The next morning, Dean arrived at the office early, as was his custom. Gabriel Barrett was already there, reviewing case files in the conference room. At 50, Gabriel was still handsome in a weathered way, his silver hair and blue eyes giving him a distinguished air that juries found trustworthy. He looked up as Dean entered, his smile genuine and warm. "Dean, how was the party last night?" "Sorry I couldn't make it. Family obligation." The casual lie rolled off Gabriel's tongue with practiced ease. Dean had seen the hotel receipts. Gabriel had spent the evening in room 1247 with a bottle of champagne and room service, waiting for Judy to arrive after the party. "It was enlightening," Dean said, settling into his chair. "My parents can be challenging sometimes." Gabriel chuckled. "All families have their dynamics. How's Judy handling everything?" The question was carefully neutral, but Dean caught the underlying interest. Gabriel was fishing for information about Judy's emotional state, looking for vulnerabilities he could exploit. "She's perfect as always," Dean replied. "Actually, I wanted to discuss the Hartwell merger. I think we need to restructure our approach." For the next hour, they discussed legal strategy, their conversation professional and collegial. But Dean was studying Gabriel, cataloging his tells, his weaknesses, his patterns of manipulation. By the time the meeting ended, Dean had identified exactly how he would destroy his partner. That afternoon, Dean called a meeting with his father. Arthur Duran's office occupied an entire floor of the Duran building, a monument to 4 generations of wealth and influence. The older man looked up from his desk as Dean entered, his expression cautiously pleased. "This is unexpected," Arthur said. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Dean settled into the chair across from his father's desk, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "I wanted to thank you for hosting the party last night. It was illuminating." Arthur leaned back, a satisfied smile playing at his lips. "I hope we made the right impression on your in-laws. That Stan Morton seems like a simple man." "Very simple," Dean agreed. "The kind of man who might not understand the complexities of our world." "Exactly." Arthur's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who believed his prejudices had been confirmed. "I hope Judy understands how lucky she is to have married into our family. Not everyone gets the opportunity to rise so far above their origins." Dean nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of opportunities, I've been thinking about expanding our charitable giving. The Duran Foundation does excellent work, but I think we could make an even bigger impact." Arthur's eyes lit up. The Duran Foundation was his pride and joy, the vehicle through which he maintained his social standing and tax advantages. "What did you have in mind?" "A scholarship program for adult learners. People who overcome significant obstacles to pursue education later in life." Dean paused, letting the idea settle. "We could call it the Morton Foundation Scholarship, named after Judy's father, to honor his achievement." Arthur's face went pale, then red. Absolutely not. I will not have the Duran name associated with that man's situation. Of course, Dean said, his voice understanding. I just thought it might be meaningful to Judy. But you're right. We should maintain our standards. Arthur relaxed, believing he'd successfully asserted his authority. But Dean was already 3 moves ahead, knowing that his father's refusal would become another weapon in the arsenal he was building. As Dean left his father's office, his phone buzzed with another message from Kelvin. Stan Morton is getting a lot of interest from the journalist. Wants to set up formal interviews about his daughter's success and their relationship. He's extremely grateful for the attention. Dean smiled as he read the message. Stan Morton, desperate for recognition and validation after decades of invisibility, was walking directly into the trap Dean had set. Soon, Stan will be sharing stories about his daughter, her childhood, her dreams, her character. Stories that would become the foundation for everything that came next. Because Dean had realized something crucial. The best revenge wasn't just destroying his enemies. It was making them destroy themselves, using their own weaknesses and desires against them. Gabriel Barrett's arrogance would be his downfall. Arthur and Rita Duran's prejudice would expose them. And Judy's shame about her origins would become the very thing that stripped away everything she'd gained. The trap was set. Now Dean just had to wait for his prey to walk into it. Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. 3 weeks after the graduation party, Dean's plan began to unfold with the precision of a Swiss watch. He sat in his office, reviewing the morning's developments with the satisfaction of a chess master who could see 20 moves ahead. Kelvin Riley's journalism project had yielded a treasure trove of information. Stan Morton, starved for recognition and dignity after a lifetime of invisibility, had opened up completely to the supposed journalist. Hours of recorded interviews detailed not just Stan's struggles and sacrifices, but his deep insights into Judy's character. Insights that painted a picture very different from the polished professional she presented to the world. She was always ashamed, Stan had admitted during one session, his voice heavy with pain. Even as a little girl, she'd tell her teachers I worked maintenance instead of saying I cleaned toilets. I thought she'd grown out of it, but at that party, the way she looked at me. The recordings revealed a father's heartbreak and a daughter's lifelong pattern of deception and selfishness. Judy had been borrowing money from her father for years, small amounts he couldn't afford, always promising to pay him back, but never following through. She'd missed his birthday 4 years running, claiming work obligations while posting photos from expensive restaurants on social media. But the most damaging revelation came when Stan admitted that Judy had asked him not to attend her law school graduation. She said the ceremony would be too long, that I'd be uncomfortable in the crowds, Stan had said, his voice breaking. But I saw the photos online. Her husband's parents were there. His whole family was there. Just not me. Dean closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Judy's betrayal of her father ran deeper than even he had imagined. It wasn't just shame. It was calculated erasure of the man who had given her everything. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Dean Duran. Mr. Duran? This is Verna Hopper from the Chicago Tribune. I'm working on a feature story about inspiring individuals in our community, and I'd like to discuss your father-in-law, Stan Morton. Dean's pulse quickened. This was earlier than expected, but it was exactly what he'd been working toward. Kelvin had done his job perfectly, establishing the fictional journalist persona and then transitioning Stan to a real reporter who believed she was following up on a legitimate human interest story. I'm not sure what you mean, Dean said carefully. Oh, I think there's been some miscommunication. I was told by my colleague that Mr. Morton's story, a single father working multiple jobs to put his daughter through law school, then pursuing his own education at 55, would make an inspiring piece. Apparently his daughter is married to a prominent attorney. Stan Morton is indeed my father-in-law, Dean confirmed. But I'm afraid any story would need to be coordinated through our family's publicist. We're quite private about personal matters. Of course I understand. But Mr. Morton himself was quite eager to share his story. He spoke very passionately about his daughter's success and their close relationship. Dean allowed a pause, as if considering. I see. Well, if Stan wants to speak publicly about our family, that certainly is right. I just hope he's accurate in his statements. The reporter's interest sharpened. Is there reason to believe he might not be? Not all, Dean said quickly. Stan's a good man, very devoted to Judy. Sometimes his enthusiasm for his daughter's success might lead him to embellish their relationship, but it comes from a place of love. After ending the call, Dean smiled. The seed was planted. A reporter was now investigating Stan Morton's story with the understanding that there might be discrepancies between his version of events and reality. When those discrepancies were revealed, and they would be, the story would become something much larger than a simple human interest piece. That evening, Dean arrived home to find Judy in their bedroom, getting ready for another of her mysterious evening commitments. She stood before the mirror in black lingerie, her auburn hair falling in waves over her shoulders. Once, the sight would have filled him with desire. Now it only confirmed what he already knew. Going somewhere special? He asked, settling into the armchair by the window. Judy didn't turn around, but her hands paused in applying her lipstick. Just dinner with Casey and Mandy. Girls' night. The lie came so easily, Dean almost admired her skill. Casey Hayes and Mandy Curry were indeed her friends, but according to his surveillance, they were both out of town this week. Judy was becoming sloppy, overconfident in her deception. That sounds nice, Dean said. Where are you going? That new place on Rush Street. Ambience, I think it's called. Another lie. Ambience was a restaurant that had closed 6 months ago. Judy was making up details on the spot, probably planning to meet Gabriel at their usual hotel. I might be late tonight myself, Dean said casually, working on the Morrison case. Relief flickered across Judy's face. Of course. Don't wait up. As she left, Dean felt a familiar mixture of rage and disgust. But underneath those emotions was something else. Anticipation. Because tonight, while Judy thought she was safe in her lover's arms, Dean would be implementing the next phase of his plan. An hour later, Dean sat in his car outside the Fairmont Hotel, watching Gabriel Barrett's BMW pull into the parking garage. 15 minutes later, Judy's Mercedes followed. Dean waited another 10 minutes, then made his call. This is Dean Duran calling for hotel security. I need to report a potential fraud involving a credit card used at your establishment tonight. The conversation that followed was brief and professional. Dean explained that his corporate card had been reported stolen and might be used fraudulently. He provided Gabriel Barrett's name and room number, information he'd obtained through careful investigation. Within minutes, hotel security was reviewing the charges to room 1247. What they found was interesting. The room was registered to Barrett and Associates law firm, ostensibly for client meetings. But the charges, expensive champagne, room service for two, extended stay fees, suggested personal rather than professional use. The hotel's corporate fraud department would be very interested in this discrepancy. Dean's next call was to the Illinois State Bar Association's ethics hotline. He reported, anonymously, concerns about a partner at Barrett and Associates potentially misusing firm resources for personal relationships. He provided just enough detail to trigger an investigation without revealing his identity. By the time Judy and Gabriel finished their tryst, Dean had set in motion a chain of events that would systematically destroy Gabriel's professional reputation. The ethics investigation would uncover the misuse of firm resources. The hotel's corporate fraud department would cooperate fully with any legal proceedings. And when Gabriel's relationship with Judy became public, as it inevitably would, his pattern of preying on vulnerable women would become impossible to ignore. But Dean wasn't finished. His final call of the evening was to Jeremy Potter, a partner at Morrison & Associates, Gabriel's former girlfriend Celeste Poole's current employer. Jeremy, it's Dean Duran. I hope I'm not calling too late. Not all, Dean. What can I do for you? I want to give you a heads up about something sensitive. I've received some information suggesting that one of your paralegals might be involved in an inappropriate relationship with a partner at another firm. I thought you should know before it becomes a larger issue. Jeremy's voice sharpened. What kind of inappropriate relationship? The kind that involves professional conflicts of interest and potential breaches of client confidentiality. I'm not making accusations, but if Celeste Poole has been sharing information about your clients with Gabriel Barrett, Dean let the implication hang in the air. Jeremy Potter was known for his paranoia about corporate espionage, and a suggestion that one of his employees might be compromising client information would trigger an immediate and thorough investigation. When Judy returned home at midnight, Dean was in his study, apparently absorbed in legal briefs. She appeared in the doorway, her hair slightly mussed, her makeup expertly repaired. "How was dinner?" he asked without looking up. "Nice. We ended up at that little Italian place instead. Ambience was too crowded." Another lie, smoothly delivered. Dean made a note in the margin of his brief, as if her answer was completely uninteresting. "I'm glad you had fun. I'll be up in a few minutes." Judy disappeared upstairs, and Dean returned to his real work, finalizing the plans that would destroy everyone who had betrayed him. The ethics investigation would take several weeks to unfold. The hotel fraud case would build slowly. The investigation at Morrison & Associates would reveal Gabriel's manipulative pattern with multiple women. And through it all, the story of Stan Morton, the devoted father abandoned by his ungrateful daughter, would be building momentum in the media, creating a narrative that would make Judy's public humiliation complete. Dean's phone buzzed with a text from Kelvin. Tribune reporter is very interested in the Stan Morton story. She's found some discrepancies between his account and social media evidence. Planning a follow-up interview with him tomorrow. Perfect. Stan Morton, in his eagerness to be recognized and valued, would soon be sharing his story with a much wider audience. The same audience that would shortly learn about his daughter's affair, her husband's partnership with her lover, and her systematic rejection of the father who had sacrificed everything for her success. Dean smiled as he considered the beautiful symmetry of it all. Judy had chosen shame over loyalty at the graduation party. Soon, she would discover that shame, once unleashed, had a way of consuming everything in its path. The trap was closing, and his prey had no idea they were already caught. Chapter 4. The Web Titans. The morning headlines in the Chicago Tribune's Metro section would have seemed innocuous to most readers, from custodian to college graduate, a father's inspiring journey. But Dean Duran read the article with the satisfaction of an architect watching his blueprint come to life. Verna Hopper had crafted exactly the story Dean had hoped for. Stan Morton was portrayed as a heroic figure, a single father who had worked 3 jobs for decades to provide for his daughter, who had cleaned toilets and washed dishes with quiet dignity while putting himself through night school. The article painted him as the embodiment of the American dream, a man who had overcome poverty and loss through sheer determination. But buried within the glowing profile were the carefully planted seeds of doubt. Quotes from Stan about his close relationship with a successful daughter were contrasted with social media evidence showing years of missed birthdays and family events. Stan's proud assertions about Judy's achievements were undercut by subtle observations about the different worlds they now inhabited. Most importantly, the article included Stan's heartfelt account of his graduation party, hosted by my daughter's generous in-laws, where he felt so welcome and included in celebrating this milestone. The reporter had been thorough enough to verify the guest list and social media posts from that evening, finding images that told a very different story about Stan's reception at the party. Dean's phone rang as he finished reading the article. Gabriel Barrett's name appeared on the screen, and Dean answered with perfectly calibrated concern. "Gabriel, good morning. I just saw the Tribune article. I had no idea they were planning to run something about Judy's father." Gabriel's voice was tight, with barely controlled panic. "Dean, we need to talk. Can you come in early today?" "Of course. Is everything all right? We need to discuss some developments regarding the firm." Dean arrived at Barrett & Associates to find Gabriel pacing in his office, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. Coffee stains marked his shirt, and his silver hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it all morning. "What's wrong?" Dean asked, settling into a chair with studied casualness. Gabriel turned to face him, his blue eyes haunted. "The State Bar Association contacted me yesterday. They're opening an ethics investigation based on anonymous allegations about misuse of firm resources." Dean frowned, projecting confused concern. "What kind of misuse?" "Personal expenses charged to the firm. Client development funds used for inappropriate purposes." Gabriel's voice cracked slightly. "Dean, they have records going back months. Hotel rooms, restaurant charges, everything documented. That's ridiculous, Dean said with perfect conviction. You're one of the most ethical attorneys I know. What possible personal expenses could they be questioning? Gabriel's face went pale. He couldn't tell his partner that the client development expenses in question were actually charges for hotel rooms where he'd been conducting his affair with Dean's wife. He couldn't explain that the expensive dinners and champagne were part of his seduction of Judy, not legitimate business entertainment. I don't know, Gabriel lied. There must be some mistake in their records. But until this is resolved, the managing committee wants me to take a leave of absence. Dean's expression shifted to one of shock and concern. Gabriel, that's terrible. Is there anything I can do? Should we hire outside counsel to represent you? No, Gabriel said quickly. I need to handle this quietly. The last thing we need is more attention on the firm. But attention was exactly what Dean intended to generate. That afternoon, while Gabriel was meeting with his personal attorney, Dean placed a carefully planned call to Saul McFarland, a reporter who covered legal affairs for the Chicago Business Journal. Saul, this is Dean Duran. I wanted to give you a heads up about something that might interest your readers. What's going on, Dean? There are rumors circulating about an ethics investigation involving a partner at a major Chicago firm. Nothing confirmed, but given the climate around attorney conduct these days, I thought it might be worth your attention. Saul's interest was immediate. The legal community was still reeling from several high-profile ethics scandals, and any new investigation would be significant news. Can you give me any specifics? I really can't, given the confidential nature of these proceedings. But I will say that it involves allegations of misuse of client funds and potentially inappropriate relationships. The firm in question has a very high profile in the Chicago legal market. Dean provided just enough information to point Saul toward Barrett and Associates without explicitly naming the firm. By the end of the week, Saul would have uncovered the ethics investigation through his own sources, making the story legitimate and newsworthy. That evening, Dean returned home to find Judy in an unusual state of agitation. She was sitting at the kitchen island, her laptop open, scrolling frantically through social media. "Have you seen this?" she asked without preamble, turning the screen toward him. The Tribune article about Stan Morton was displayed, along with dozens of comments from readers. Most were positive, praising Stan's determination and work ethic. But several comments had noticed the discrepancies between Stan's claims about his relationship with his daughter and the evidence visible in social media posts. "Your father seems like a remarkable man," Dean said carefully. "Though I notice some people are questioning whether his account of your relationship is entirely accurate." Judy's face flushed red. "These people don't know anything about our relationship. They're just looking for drama." "Of course," Dean agreed. "But you have to admit, some of the evidence they're pointing to is concerning. Like that post from your law school graduation where your parents are tagged, but your father isn't in any of the photos." Judy slammed the laptop shut. "I told him his ceremony would be too long, that he'd be uncomfortable. I was protecting him." "I understand," Dean said, moving behind her chair and placing his hands on her shoulders. "But maybe this is an opportunity to address some of these misunderstandings. You could reach out to your father, maybe plan some visible gestures of support." The suggestion was perfectly reasonable, but Dean knew Judy well enough to predict a response. She was trapped between her shame about her father and her need to protect her public image. Any attempt to suddenly embrace Stan publicly would look calculated and false, while continuing to ignore him would only validate the growing narrative about her character. "I don't need to prove anything to strangers on the internet," Judy said, but her voice lacked conviction. Dean's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it casually, then frowned. "What is it?" Judy asked. "Gabriel's having some kind of crisis at work. Ethics investigation or something. He wants to meet for drinks tonight to discuss it." Judy's face went white. "What kind of ethics investigation?" "I'm not sure. Something about misuse of funds. You know how these things go. Usually just bureaucratic nonsense, but it can be damaging to a career even when it's unfounded." Judy stared at him, and Dean could see the wheels turning in her mind. If Gabriel was under investigation, if his career was in jeopardy, what did that mean for their relationship? What did it mean for her future? "You should go," she said finally. "Gabriel's your partner. He needs your support. Dean kissed her forehead gently. You're right. I'll try not to be too late. But instead of meeting Gabriel, Dean drove to Lincoln Park, where he sat his car outside Stan Morton's modest apartment building. Through a second-floor window, he could see the older man at his kitchen table, apparently reading something on a tablet, probably the comments on the Tribune article. Dean's phone rang. It was Kelvin Riley. Stan's been getting calls all day, Kelvin reported. Local news stations, a couple of online publications, even a radio show. Everyone wants to follow up on the Tribune story. How's he handling it? He's overwhelmed, but grateful for the attention. He keeps saying how proud he is that people are finally hearing about Judy's accomplishments. The man has no idea that half these reporters are looking for dirt. Dean smiled grimly. Stan Morton's innocence was both heartbreaking and useful. In his eagerness to share his pride in his daughter, he was providing journalists with a detailed account of her systematic rejection of him. Every interview made Judy look worse, and Stan was too grateful for the attention to realize what was happening. Has he tried to contact Judy? Dean asked. Several times. She's not returning his calls. He mentioned to one reporter that he's been trying to reach her since the Tribune article came out, but her schedule must be very busy. Perfect. Judy's continued avoidance of her father would soon become part of the public narrative. The devoted father reaching out to share his moment of recognition. The successful daughter too busy to respond. It was a story that would resonate with readers and reflect poorly on Judy's character. Dean's final call of the evening was to Rita Duran, his mother. Her voice was sharp with irritation when she answered. Dean, it's rather late. I apologize for calling so late, Mother. I wanted to discuss the Tribune article about Stan Morton. Rita's silence was telling. She had obviously seen the article and recognized the implication for the family's reputation. What about it? She asked finally. I think we need to consider our response. The article portrays Stan as a devoted father, and there are already people online questioning why he wasn't more included in our family events. That's ridiculous. The man is a toilet cleaner, Dean. There are natural social boundaries. I understand your position, Mother, but public perception matters. If people start viewing our family as elitist or unwelcoming. Rita's voice hardened. Are you suggesting we should have pretended that man belonged at our gathering? That we should have compromised our standards to spare his feelings? Not at all, Dean said smoothly. I'm simply pointing out that our treatment of Stan might be misinterpreted by people who don't understand our world. Then perhaps those people need to learn about appropriate social distinctions, Rita replied coldly. I will not apologize for maintaining standards. Dean smiled as he ended the call. His mother's arrogance and prejudice would serve his purposes perfectly. When the story inevitably expanded to include details about how Stan was treated at the graduation party, Rita's attitude would be exposed for all to see. As he drove home, Dean reflected on the day's progress. Gabriel Barrett was panicking about the ethics investigation, his career and reputation under threat. Judy was trapped between her shame about her father and the growing public scrutiny of their relationship. The Duran family's treatment of Stan Morton was being questioned by an increasingly interested media. All the pieces were moving exactly as Dean had planned. Soon, the various threads would converge into a single, devastating narrative that would destroy everyone who had betrayed him. Judy was still awake when he returned home, sitting in their bedroom with her phone in her hands. Her face was streaked with tears, and she looked up at him with desperate eyes. How was your meeting with Gabriel? She asked. Concerning, Dean replied, beginning to undress for bed. The investigation seems more serious than he initially thought. His attorney thinks he might face suspension, possibly even disbarment. Judy's sob was audible. That's terrible. Gabriel's such a good man. He doesn't deserve this. Dean paused in removing his tie, studying his wife's face. Her tears weren't for Gabriel's professional troubles. They were for the implications of his downfall. If Gabriel lost his career, he would no longer be the powerful, successful man she'd fallen in love with. He would become just another disgraced attorney, stripped of the status and influence that had made him attractive to her. I'm sure everything will work out, Dean said gently. Gabriel's a survivor. Even if his legal career is over, he'll find another way to succeed. But they both knew that wasn't true. In Chicago's legal community, an ethics violation was a career death sentence. Gabriel Barrett would be lucky to find work as a paralegal, let alone as a practicing attorney. As Judy cried herself to sleep beside him, Dean stared at the ceiling, planning the next phase of his revenge. Tomorrow, the story would begin to expand beyond Stan Morton's inspiring journey. Soon, it would encompass his daughter's betrayal, her lover's disgrace, and the Durand family's cruelty. And at the center of it all would be Dean himself, the successful attorney whose wife had betrayed him, whose family had revealed their true nature, whose partner had proven to be a fraud. He would emerge from the scandal as the victim, the man who had been wronged by everyone he trusted. It was a role he was prepared to play to perfection. Chapter 5. The Reckoning Begins. Dean's alarm clock hadn't even sounded when his phone began buzzing with urgent calls. At 5:47 a.m., he answered to find Jeremy Potter's voice, tight with panic and rage. "Dean, I need to see you immediately. My office, 30 minutes. Jeremy, what's wrong? Just get here. Now." Dean arrived at Morrison & Associates to find Jeremy pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. The usually composed attorney looked like he hadn't slept, his tie askew and his gray hair disheveled. "Sit down," Jeremy commanded. "I need to know exactly what you told me about Celeste Poole and Gabriel Barrett." Dean settled into the chair across from Jeremy's desk, his expression carefully neutral. "I mentioned some concerns about a potential conflict of interest." "Why? What's happened?" Jeremy's face was flushed with anger. "What's happened is that my IT department discovered that Celeste has been accessing client files that had nothing to do with her assignments. Files related to cases that Barrett and Associates had competing interests in." Dean frowned, projecting appropriate concern. "That's concerning. Are you sure?" "I'm sure. We have keystroke logs, access records, everything. But that's not the worst part." Jeremy leaned forward, his voice dropping. "The worst part is that we also discovered she's been photographing documents with her personal phone. And guess who she's been texting those photos to?" Dean's expression shifted to one of shock and dismay. "Gabriel Barrett." "Gabriel Barrett," Jeremy confirmed. "For the past 6 months, Celeste Poole has been systematically stealing confidential client information and sharing it with your law partner. Do you have any idea what this means for both our firms?" Dean didn't know exactly what it meant, because he had orchestrated every bit of it. Celeste Poole's relationship with Gabriel Barrett had been real, but her access to sensitive files had been purely coincidental, until Dean arranged for Gabriel to start asking her seemingly innocent questions about her work. Gabriel, thinking he was simply showing interest in his girlfriend's career, had encouraged her to share details about her cases. Celeste, desperate to impress the sophisticated older man, had begun taking photos of documents to show him how important her work was. Neither of them had realized they were committing serious crimes: industrial espionage, theft of confidential information, violation of attorney-client privilege. They had simply been two people trying to impress each other, unwittingly walking into Dean's carefully constructed trap. "Jeremy, I'm horrified," Dean said with perfect sincerity. "Is there anything I can do to help? Any way to contain this?" Jeremy's laugh was bitter. "Contain it? Dean, this is going to destroy both our firms. When this becomes public, and it will become public, every client we've represented will question whether their confidential information was compromised. We're looking at malpractice suits, bar sanctions, possible criminal charges. Surely there's some way to handle this quietly." "There's no handling this quietly." Jeremy exploded. "I've already had to notify the State Bar Association. They're opening an immediate investigation. And because this involves potential criminal activity, they're coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office." Dean absorbed this information with the gravity it deserved. Gabriel Barrett was no longer just facing an ethics investigation for misusing firm resources. He was now looking at federal charges for corporate espionage. Celeste Poole's career was over, and she would likely face criminal prosecution as well. But the most beautiful part of Dean's plan was that Gabriel would never be able to explain his relationship with Celeste without revealing his pattern of manipulating vulnerable women, a pattern that would soon include his affair with Judy. "I need to get back to my firm," Dean said, rising from his chair. "Gabriel needs to know about this immediately." "Gabriel already knows," Jeremy said grimly. The FBI served a search warrant on Barrett and Associates this morning. They seized his computers, his phone records, everything. I suspect you'll find your partner in federal custody by the time you get to your office. Dean's drive back to Barrett and Associates was surreal. FBI vehicles lined the street outside the building, and he could see agents carrying boxes of evidence from the firm's offices. Employees stood on the sidewalk, some crying, others making frantic phone calls. Inside the building, chaos reigned. Federal agents had taken over the conference room, and Dean could see Gabriel Barrett through the glass walls, sitting at the table in handcuffs while his attorney spoke urgently with FBI agents. "Mr. Duran," a woman in a Navy suit approached him. "I'm Special Agent Vanessa Rubio, FBI. We need to speak with you about your partnership with Gabriel Barrett." For the next 3 hours, Dean answered questions with careful precision. He expressed shock and dismay at the allegations against Gabriel. He provided access to his own files and computer systems, demonstrating his complete cooperation with the investigation. He positioned himself as another victim of Gabriel's deception, a loyal partner who had been betrayed by a man he trusted. When the FBI finally released him, Dean emerged from the building to find a crowd of reporters waiting. News of the federal investigation had broken while he was being questioned, and Barrett and Associates was now the center of a major corporate espionage scandal. "Mr. Duran," reporters shouted questions as he walked toward his car. "Did you know about your partner's illegal activities? How long has this been going on? What does this mean for your clients?" Dean paused at his car, turning to face the cameras with an expression of dignified devastation. "I'm shocked and disappointed by these allegations against my partner. Barrett and Associates has always operated with the highest ethical standards, and I am committed to cooperating fully with the federal investigation. My primary concern right now is protecting our clients and ensuring they receive the representation they deserve during this difficult time." It was a perfect statement, measured, responsible, and completely self-serving. Dean positioned himself as the innocent partner who had been victimized by Gabriel's crimes, the responsible attorney who was working to protect clients from his partner's misdeeds. As he drove away from the chaos, Dean's phone rang continuously. Clients demanding explanations, reporters seeking comments, other attorneys offering condolences, and not-so-subtle inquiries about whether Barrett and Associates would survive the scandal. But the call Dean was waiting for came at 2:47 p.m. Judy's voice was hysterical, barely coherent through her sobs. "Dean, I saw the news. Gabriel's been arrested. They're saying he stole client information, that he's facing federal charges. This has to be a mistake. Where are you?" Dean asked, his voice calm and soothing. "I'm at home. I can't process this. Gabriel would never do something like this. He's being framed." Dean turned his car toward home, his pulse quickening with anticipation. This was the moment he had been building toward. The moment when Judy would realize that her lover was not the powerful, successful man she had fallen in love with, but a criminal who had destroyed his own career through greed and arrogance. "I suspected something was wrong in our marriage," Dean admitted. "Judy had been distant, distracted, but I never imagined she was capable of this level of deception." It was a masterful performance, positioning Dean as another victim of Judy's betrayal while maintaining his dignified composure. Arthur's expression softened slightly, recognizing the pain his son must be experiencing. "What are you going to do?" Arthur asked. "I'm going to protect our family's reputation and our business interests," Dean replied, "which means distancing ourselves from Judy until the federal investigation is complete." Arthur nodded approvingly. "I think that's wise. Perhaps you should consider a separation, at least until this all blows over." "I've already spoken with my attorney about that possibility," Dean said. "In fact, I may need to take more drastic action if additional evidence emerges about Judy's involvement." As if on cue, Dean's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, allowing his expression to shift to one of shock and dismay. "What is it?" Arthur asked. Dean showed him the message from his attorney. "FBI wants to interview you again. They have new evidence linking Judy to Gabriel's activities. Can you come in this afternoon?" Arthur's face went pale. "New evidence?" "I'm afraid so," Dean said grimly. "It looks like the investigation is expanding to include Judy as a potential co-conspirator. In reality, the text was from Kelvin Riley, updating Dean on the latest media developments. But Arthur didn't need to know that. He needed to believe that his daughter-in-law was about to be arrested as a federal criminal. "Dean, you need to protect yourself," Arthur said urgently. "File for divorce immediately. Distance yourself from Judy before she drags our entire family down with her." "I can't abandon my wife based on allegations," Dean protested. "What kind of man would that make me?" "A smart one," Arthur replied harshly. "This family has worked for 4 generations to build our reputation. I will not allow it to be destroyed by that toilet cleaner's daughter and her criminal behavior." The contempt in Arthur's voice was exactly what Dean had been waiting to hear. His father's prejudice and cruelty were now fully exposed, directed not just at Stan Morton, but at Judy herself. When this conversation inevitably became public, and Dean would ensure that it did, Arthur Duran would be revealed as a man who had never accepted his daughter-in-law and was eager to cast her aside the moment she became inconvenient. "I understand your position," Dean said carefully, "but I need to think about this carefully. Judy is still my wife." "Not for much longer, if you're smart," Arthur snapped. "Cut her loose, Dean, before she destroys everything we've built." Dean left his father's office with a heavy heart, not because of Arthur's advice, but because the performance was becoming exhausting. Maintaining the facade of a loyal husband while orchestrating his wife's destruction required constant vigilance and emotional control. His next stop was Barrett and Associates, where the FBI had finally completed their evidence collection. The firm's offices looked like a bomb had exploded. Filing cabinets emptied, computers removed, documents scattered across every surface. Most of the staff had been laid off, and the few remaining employees were desperately trying to contact clients about transferring their cases. Dean found his secretary, Elsie Starr, packing files into boxes with tears streaming down her face. At 62, Elsie had worked for the firm for over 20 years, and the destruction of her workplace was devastating. "Mr. Duran," she said, looking up as he entered, "I'm so sorry about all this. Mr. Barrett seemed like such a good man." "He fooled all of us, Elsie," Dean replied gently. "But we're going to rebuild. I promise you that." "What about Mrs. Duran?" Elsie asked hesitantly. "The things they're saying in the news, surely they can't be true?" Dean's expression grew pained. "I honestly don't know anymore, Elsie. I thought I knew my wife, but apparently I was wrong about a lot of things." Elsie nodded sympathetically, and Dean knew that her interpretation of his words would spread throughout Chicago's legal community within hours. The loyal secretary would share his heartbreak with other legal assistants, who would tell their attorneys, who would discuss it at bar association meetings and charity events. By evening, the story would be that Dean Duran was a devastated husband who had been blindsided by his wife's betrayal. The narrative would paint him as a victim rather than a perpetrator, a good man destroyed by the woman he had trusted most. Dean's phone rang as he was reviewing client files. The caller ID showed his home number, and Judy's voice was barely above a whisper. "Dean, I need you to come home. Please." "What's wrong?" "The FBI is here. They want to search the house. They have a warrant." Dean's pulse quickened, but his voice remained calm. "I'll be right there. Don't say anything to them until I arrive." He found his mansion surrounded by FBI vehicles, agents carrying boxes of evidence from his home. Neighbors stood on their lawns, watching the spectacle with fascination and horror. The Duran family's private shame was now a public exhibition. Inside, Special Agent Vanessa Rubio was directing the search with professional efficiency. She looked up as Dean entered, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Duran, thank you for coming. We're executing a search warrant for any evidence related to the Barrett investigation." "I understand," Dean said. "What specifically are you looking for?" "Communications between your wife and Gabriel Barrett, financial records, any documents that might shed light on Mrs. Duran's knowledge of Barrett's criminal activities." Dean nodded gravely. "Of course. I want to cooperate fully with your investigation." Judy appeared in the doorway of the living room, her face streaked with tears and her hands shaking. She looked at Dean with desperate, pleading eyes. "They've taken my computer, my phone, everything," she whispered. "They think I was helping Gabriel steal client information." "That's ridiculous," Dean said, moving to embrace her. You don't know anything about his crimes. But even as he spoke the words, Dean knew they sounded hollow. The evidence the FBI would find on Judy's devices would tell a damning story. Text messages with Gabriel discussing his work, emails about meeting times that coincided with his hotel charges, photos they had taken together in rooms paid for with stolen client funds. None of it proved that Judy knew Gabriel was committing crimes, but all of it suggested a level of involvement that would be difficult to explain away. The federal prosecutors would use the evidence to pressure Judy into cooperating against Gabriel, offering her immunity in exchange for testimony about his criminal activities. But Judy had no useful information to offer because Gabriel had never involved her in his actual crimes. She had been nothing more than a mistress, unaware of her lover's criminal activities. Her only value to the government would be as another example of Gabriel's pattern of manipulation and deception. Mrs. Duran, Agent Rubio said, approaching them. We'll need you to come with us for additional questioning. Am I being arrested? Judy asked, her voice breaking. Not at this time, but we have some new evidence we'd like to discuss with you. He found Judy curled on their living room sofa, still in her pajamas despite the late hour. Her face was swollen from crying, her auburn hair tangled and unwashed. She looked up at him with desperate, pleading eyes. Tell me this isn't real, she whispered. Tell me Gabriel isn't really going to prison. Dean sat beside her, pulling her into his arms with gentle compassion. I'm afraid it's very real, sweetheart. The evidence against Gabriel is overwhelming. The FBI has documented months of criminal activity. But why would he do this? He's already successful, already wealthy. Why would he risk everything for industrial espionage? Dean stroked her hair, his voice tender with understanding. I think Gabriel has been living beyond his means for a long time. The expensive hotels, the lavish dinners, the lifestyle he's been maintaining, it all costs money. Maybe he thought he could make some quick profits by selling confidential information. It was a plausible explanation, one that painted Gabriel as a man whose greed had overcome his judgment. But Dean knew the real reason Gabriel had encouraged Celeste to share confidential information. It had been a way to demonstrate his interest in her work, to make her feel valued and important. Gabriel's downfall hadn't been greed. It had been his compulsive need to manipulate and seduce vulnerable women. What happens now? Judy asked, her voice small and broken. Gabriel will probably be convicted and sentenced to federal prison. His law license will be revoked. He'll lose everything: his career, his reputation, his freedom. Judy began crying again, and Dean held her closer, making soothing sounds while internally savoring her devastation. Gabriel Barrett's arrest was only the beginning. Soon, the investigation would uncover his relationship with Judy, and her affair would become public knowledge. The narrative would write itself. The successful attorney's wife, seduced by her husband's criminal partner, complicit in the betrayal of everything her husband had worked to build. I need to call him, Judy said suddenly, pulling away from Dean's embrace. I need to let him know that someone believes in him. Dean's hand closed gently around her wrist. Sweetheart, I don't think that's a good idea. Gabriel's phone is probably being monitored by the FBI. Any contact with him could be misinterpreted. Misinterpreted how? Dean's expression grew troubled, as if he was reluctant to voice his concerns. The FBI will be looking into all of Gabriel's relationships, both professional and personal. They'll want to know if anyone else was involved in his crimes, or if anyone helped him in any way. Judy's face went pale. You think they might suspect me of something? Of course not, Dean said quickly. But you know how these investigations work. They cast a wide net, and sometimes innocent people get caught up in the process. The safest thing for you, for both of us, is to maintain distance from Gabriel until this all gets resolved. Judy nodded slowly, but Dean could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to reach out to Gabriel, to offer comfort and support in his darkest hour. But she was also terrified of being implicated in his crimes. Dean's phone buzzed with a text from Kelvin Riley. Stan Morton just got a call from CNN. They want to interview him about his daughter's reaction to his recent media attention. Apparently, they've noticed she hasn't made any public statements supporting her father despite all the coverage. Perfect. While Judy was dealing with her lover's arrest and imprisonment, she would also have to confront the growing media narrative about her abandonment of her father. The two stories would eventually merge into a single, devastating portrait of a woman who betrayed everyone who loved her. "I need to get back to the office," Dean said, kissing Judy's forehead. "There are a lot of decisions to make about the firm's future. Will you be all right?" Judy nodded, but her eyes were distant, lost in thoughts of Gabriel Barrett sitting in a federal holding cell, facing decades in prison for crimes that would strip away everything he had built. As Dean left his broken wife alone in their mansion, he reflected on the beautiful irony of the situation. Judy had chosen Gabriel Barrett because he represented power, success, and status, everything she had always craved. Now Gabriel was powerless, ruined, and facing a future that would make her father's life look privileged by comparison. Soon, Judy would have to choose between loyalty to her imprisoned lover and self-preservation. And Dean knew exactly what choice she would make, because he had always understood her character better than she understood it herself. The web was closing around all his enemies, and Dean Duran was just getting started. Chapter 6, The Walls Close In. The headlines dominated Chicago's morning news cycle. Federal investigation expands. Attorney's wife linked to corporate espionage ring. Dean read the Chicago Tribune article over his morning coffee, admiring the reporter's skillful weaving of facts that painted Judy as a potential accomplice in Gabriel Barrett's crimes. The story revealed that Judy Duran had been observed entering the Fairmont Hotel on multiple occasions over the past 8 months. The same hotel where Gabriel Barrett had charged client entertainment expenses that were now part of the federal investigation. The article carefully avoided direct accusations, but the implications were clear. Judy might have been more than just an innocent bystander in her husband's partner's criminal activities. What the reporters didn't know was that Dean had provided every piece of evidence they needed, carefully leaked through intermediaries and anonymous tips. Hotel security footage, credit card records, phone logs, all legally obtained and strategically distributed to ensure maximum damage to Judy's reputation. Dean's phone rang as he finished reading. The caller ID showed Arthur Duran, and Dean could hear the panic in his father's voice even before he spoke. "Dean, we need to talk immediately. This situation with your wife has gotten completely out of hand." "I'll be right there, Father." Arthur Duran's office felt like a fortress under siege. The older man paced behind his desk, his usual composure shattered by the media attention that was now threatening the family's carefully maintained reputation. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to our name?" Arthur demanded. The Tribune, the Sun-Times, even the Wall Street Journal are running stories about the Duran family. Our clients are asking questions. Board members are expressing concerns. Dean settled into his chair with studied calm. "I understand your frustration, Father. But Judy is innocent of any wrongdoing. The media is simply connecting dots that don't actually form a picture." "Innocent." Arthur's voice rose to a near shout. "Your wife was having an affair with a federal criminal. She was meeting him in hotel rooms while he was stealing client information. How is that innocent?" "The affair is news to me," Dean lied smoothly. "If it's true, then I'm obviously devastated by Judy's betrayal. But having an affair isn't a federal crime." Arthur studied his son's face, searching for cracks in his composed exterior. "You really didn't know?" Dean watched his wife being led away by federal agents, knowing that this might be the last time he saw her as a free woman. The evidence against Gabriel Barrett was overwhelming, and the prosecutors would want someone else to blame for the scope of the criminal conspiracy. Judy, with her documented relationship with Gabriel and her presence at key moments in his scheme, would be the perfect secondary target. As the FBI finished their search and departed, Dean stood alone in his ransacked home, surrounded by the debris of his carefully constructed life. Every room had been violated, every private space exposed and examined. But instead of feeling violated, Dean felt triumphant. The search warrant was the final piece of evidence he needed to complete his revenge. Now he could legitimately claim that his wife was under federal investigation, that their marriage had been irreparably damaged by her betrayal and potential criminal activity. The divorce papers he would file tomorrow would paint him as a victim fleeing a criminal conspiracy. The media would portray him as a loyal husband who had been deceived by a woman whose greed and ambition had led her into federal crime. And through it all, Stan Morton's story would continue to unfold in the background. The devoted father abandoned by his ungrateful daughter. The working-class hero whose sacrifice had been repaid with shame and rejection. Dean smiled as he surveyed the wreckage of his home. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. Chapter 7. The Trap Springs. 3 days after the FBI search, Dean sat in his attorney's office, signing divorce papers with the solemnity of a man attending his own funeral. Dominic Bassett, one of Chicago's most ruthless divorce attorneys, watched his client with professional admiration. "This is exactly the right move," Dominic said, reviewing the documents. "Filing immediately after the federal investigation becomes public shows that you're distancing yourself from criminal activity. The timing couldn't be better." Dean's divorce petition was a masterpiece of legal strategy and public relations. It portrayed him as a devoted husband who had discovered his wife's affair and potential criminal involvement through the FBI investigation. The filing included a request for immediate separation of assets, claiming that Judy's criminal exposure posed a threat to the family's legitimate business interests. Most damaging of all, the petition included Dean's sworn statement that he had been shocked and devastated to learn of my wife's intimate relationship with my business partner during the same period he was engaged in federal crimes. The statement carefully avoided accusing Judy of criminal knowledge while implying that her affair had compromised Dean both personally and professionally. "The media is going to have a field day with this," Dominic continued. "Loyal husband betrayed by criminal wife. It's a story that writes itself." Dean's phone buzzed with a call from Kelvin Riley. "Turn on Channel 7, Kelvin said without preamble. "Stan Morton is giving a live interview about his daughter's situation." Dean found the nearest television and switched to the local news station. Stan Morton sat across from reporter Diane Summers, his weathered face creased with pain and confusion. He wore his best suit, the same one from the graduation party, and his hand shook slightly as he spoke. "I don't understand what's happening," Stan was saying. "The reporters are calling me, asking about Judy's marriage, about her relationship with this Barrett fellow. I told them I don't know anything about that. I haven't talked to my daughter in weeks." "Mr. Morton," Diane Summers pressed gently, "you mentioned that you've been trying to reach your daughter since this story broke. Has she responded to your calls?" Stan's voice broke slightly. "No, she hasn't. I've left messages, sent texts. I just want to know if she's okay, if there's anything I can do to help her. But she won't talk to me. How does that make you feel?" Stan looked directly into the camera, and Dean could see the lifetime of hurt and disappointment in his eyes. "It makes me feel like maybe I failed her somehow. Like maybe I wasn't the father she needed me to be. But I try my best. I gave her everything I had." The interview continued for another 10 minutes, with Stan deflecting questions about Judy's alleged criminal involvement while expressing his unconditional love and support for his daughter. He looked like exactly what he was, a simple, honest man whose world had been turned upside down by forces he couldn't understand. The contrast between Stan's loyalty and Judy's silence was devastating. While her father publicly defended her and begged for any contact, Judy remained hidden, protected by high-priced attorneys and the walls of her mansion. Dean's satisfaction was interrupted by Dominic's voice. "Dean, you need to see this." On Dominic's computer screen was a breaking news alert. Judy Duran, wife of prominent attorney, arrested on federal conspiracy charges. Dean felt his pulse quicken, though he maintained his composed exterior. The arrest was earlier than he had expected, but it fit perfectly with his timeline. The federal prosecutors had clearly decided that Judy made a valuable secondary target, someone whose prosecution would demonstrate the scope of Gabriel Barrett's criminal enterprise. "I need to get to the courthouse," Dean said, rising from his chair. "Dean," Dominic said seriously, "remember what we discussed. You are not her husband anymore. You are a victim of her criminal conspiracy. Do not let emotion override strategy." Dean nodded grimly. "I understand." The federal courthouse was surrounded by news vans and reporters when Dean arrived. Inside, he found Judy in handcuffs, sitting beside a public defender who looked overwhelmed by the media attention. Her auburn hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and her eyes were red from crying. She looked up as Dean entered the courtroom, and the hope that flickered across her face was heartbreaking. For a moment, she still believed that her husband would stand by her, that their marriage vows would override the criminal charges she was facing. "Dean," she whispered as he approached, "thank God you're here. I need you to call Vincent Morrison. He handles federal cases. I can't afford a real attorney right now." Dean's expression was carefully neutral as he looked down at his wife. "Judy, I filed for divorce yesterday morning. I can't help you anymore." The words hit Judy like a physical blow. Her face went white, and she stared at Dean with disbelief and betrayal. "What do you mean you filed for divorce?" "I mean our marriage is over," Dean said quietly. "I can't be associated with someone who's facing federal criminal charges. It would destroy my career, my family's reputation. But I'm innocent." Judy's voice rose, drawing the attention of everyone in the courtroom. "I didn't know what Gabriel was doing. You were just having an affair with my business partner while he was committing federal crimes," Dean finished. "That's not exactly a strong defense." The public defender leaned over to whisper urgently in Judy's ear, probably advising her to stop talking about her case in open court. But Judy was beyond caring about legal strategy. Her world was collapsing around her, and the man she had counted on for support was walking away. "Please," she whispered, reaching for Dean's hand. "I know I made mistakes, but I'm still your wife. I need you." Dean allowed her to take his hand for a moment, then gently pulled away. "You stopped being my wife the day you chose Gabriel Barrett over our marriage. I hope you find a way through this, Judy. I really do." As Dean turned to leave the courtroom, he could hear Judy's sobs echoing behind him. The sound should have filled him with satisfaction, but instead he felt only a cold emptiness. Revenge, he was discovering, was a dish that left him hungry no matter how much he consumed. Outside the courthouse, Dean was immediately surrounded by reporters. Camera lights blazed as journalists shouted questions about his divorce filing and his wife's arrest. "Mr. Duran, how long have you known about your wife's affair? Did you suspect she was involved in criminal activity? Will you be testifying against your wife in her federal trial?" Dean paused at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out at the crowd of reporters with dignified pain. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had been betrayed by everyone he trusted most. "My wife's arrest comes as a complete shock to me," he said. "I believed I was married to a woman of integrity and honor. To learn that she was conducting an affair with my business partner while he was engaged in criminal activity is devastating beyond words." He paused, allowing the gravity of his statement to settle. "I have cooperated fully with the federal investigation, and I will continue to cooperate in any way that helps bring justice for the clients who are harmed by these crimes. But I cannot and will not allow my wife's alleged criminal activities to destroy my family's reputation or my ability to serve my remaining clients." It was a perfect statement, measured, responsible, and completely self-serving. Dean positioned himself as another victim of the criminal conspiracy, a loyal husband who had been deceived and betrayed by his wife's greed and infidelity. As he walked away from the courthouse, Dean's phone rang with a call from Stan Morton. The older man's voice was shaky with emotion. "Mr. Duran, this is Stan Morton, Judy's father. I just saw the news about her arrest and about your divorce filing. I was hoping we could talk." "Of course, Mr. Morton. I'm very sorry about everything that's happening. Could we meet somewhere? I know you're probably angry at Judy, and you have every right to be. But she's still my daughter, and I'm trying to understand what went wrong." Dean agreed to meet Stan at a coffee shop near the courthouse. The conversation that followed would be the final piece of his revenge, a meeting between the devoted father and the betrayed husband, both victims of Judy's selfishness and greed. When Stan Morton arrived at the coffee shop, he looked like he had aged 10 years in the past month. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with worry and confusion. He sat across from Dean with the careful posture of a man who knew he was out of his depth. "Thank you for seeing me," Stan said. "I know this must be difficult for you." "I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk," Dean replied. "Judy is lucky to have a father who loves her so unconditionally." Stan's eyes filled with tears. "I keep thinking I must have done something wrong, raised her wrong somehow. The woman they're describing in the news, having an affair, involved with criminals, that's not the daughter I raised. Dean studied Stan's face, seeing the genuine anguish of a father trying to reconcile his love for his child with the reality of her actions. This was the man Judy had abandoned, the father she had been ashamed of, sitting across from the husband she had betrayed. "You did nothing wrong, Mr. Morton," Dean said gently. "You raised Judy to be ambitious, to want more than what she grew up with. Unfortunately, her ambition led her to make some very poor choices. Do you think she really knew what this Barrett fellow was doing?" Dean considered the question carefully. "I think Judy knew Gabriel was using firm resources for personal expenses. Whether she understood the full scope of his criminal activity, I'm not sure. But she certainly knew their relationship was inappropriate." Stan nodded slowly, processing this information. "What happens to her now?" "She'll probably be offered a plea agreement in exchange for testimony against Gabriel. If she's smart, she'll take it. The federal government doesn't like to lose cases, and they have enough evidence to convict both of them." "And what about you? What happens to your marriage?" Dean's expression grew pained. "There's no marriage anymore, Mr. Morton. Judy made her choice when she decided to have an affair with my business partner. I can't rebuild a life with someone I can't trust." The two men sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts about the woman who had betrayed them both. Finally, Stan spoke. "I keep thinking about that night at the graduation party. The way she looked at me, like she was ashamed of who I was. I thought maybe it was just the pressure of the moment, but now I wonder if that's how she's always seen me." Dean felt a flicker of genuine sympathy for the older man. Stan Morton had sacrificed everything for his daughter, only to discover that his love had never been returned with the same intensity. "Judy has always wanted to be someone else," Dean said carefully. "Someone with more status, more wealth, more sophistication. I think she saw both of us as obstacles to becoming that person." Stan's face crumpled with grief. "I just wanted her to be happy. I worked 3 jobs so she could have opportunities one never had. But maybe I pushed her too hard, made her think she needed to be ashamed of where she came from." "You gave her everything a father could give," Dean said firmly. "The choices she made after that were hers alone." As they parted ways outside the coffee shop, Dean watched Stan Morton walk slowly toward his old Honda Civic. The man looked broken, defeated by the realization that his daughter's love had always been conditional on his ability to enhance rather than embarrass her. Dean felt no satisfaction in Stan's pain, because Stan Morton was genuinely innocent. He was collateral damage in Dean's war against the people who had actually betrayed him. But sometimes, Dean reflected, innocent people got hurt when the guilty were brought to justice. The next morning's headlines would tell the story of 2 men united in their betrayal by the woman they had both loved. Father and husband seek answers after Judy Duran's federal arrest. The narrative was almost complete. Soon, the final chapter would unfold, and everyone who had wronged Dean Duran would face the consequences of their choices. Chapter 8. The Reckoning unfolds. 6 weeks after Judy's arrest, Dean stood in the empty conference room of what had once been Barrett & Associates, watching movers carry away the last pieces of furniture. The firm's dissolution was complete. Assets liquidated, clients transferred, employees scattered to other practices. Gabriel Barrett's name would soon be stripped from the building directory, erased from the Chicago legal community as if he had never existed. The federal trial had been swift and devastating. Gabriel Barrett, faced with overwhelming evidence of corporate espionage and theft of confidential information, had accepted a plea agreement that would send him to federal prison for 12 years. His law license was permanently revoked, his assets seized to pay restitution to his victims, his reputation destroyed beyond any possibility of redemption. Celeste Poole had received a lighter sentence, 5 years in federal prison for her role in the conspiracy. Her testimony had been crucial in securing Gabriel's conviction, revealing a pattern of manipulation and exploitation that painted him as a predator who had used his position to take advantage of vulnerable women. But it was Judy's trial that had captivated Chicago's attention. The proceedings had exposed every detail of her affair with Gabriel, every hotel meeting and clandestine text message. The prosecution had portrayed her as a willing participant in Gabriel's crimes, arguing that her intimate relationship with him made it impossible for her to claim ignorance of his illegal activities. Judy's defense attorney had tried to paint her as another victim of Gabriel's manipulation, a naive woman who had been seduced by a master manipulator. But the evidence told a different story, one of a woman who had willingly participated in the deception of her husband while enjoying the benefits of her lover's criminal activities. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Judy guilty on conspiracy charges. Her sentence, 3 years in federal prison, had been lighter than Gabriel's, but devastating nonetheless. She would serve her time at a minimum security facility in Kentucky, far from the Chicago social circles where she had once moved with such confidence. Dean's phone buzzed with a call from Saul McFarland at the Chicago Business Journal. The reporter had been following the Barrett scandal since its beginning, and his coverage had been instrumental in shaping public perception of the case. "Dean, I wanted to give you a heads up about tomorrow's story. We're running a comprehensive piece about how you've rebuilt your practice since the Barrett investigation. The angle is about resilience and integrity in the face of betrayal." Dean smiled grimly. The story would position him exactly as he had planned. The principled attorney who had been victimized by his partner's crimes and his wife's infidelity, but who had emerged stronger and more committed to ethical practice. "I appreciate the coverage, Saul. It's been a difficult time, but I believe we've emerged as a better firm. What about your personal situation? Any thoughts on rebuilding your life after the divorce?" Dean paused, considering his response. "I'm focused on my work right now. The betrayals I've experienced have made me more cautious about trusting people, but they've also reminded me of what really matters: serving clients with integrity and maintaining the highest ethical standards." It was the perfect answer, portraying him as a man who had been wounded but not defeated, who had learned from his experience without becoming bitter or cynical. After ending the call, Dean drove to Lincoln Park, where his parents were hosting a small gathering to celebrate the end of the Barrett investigation. The guest list was carefully curated, Chicago's legal and social elite, all eager to show their support for the Duran family now that the scandal had been resolved in their favor. Arthur Duran greeted his son with obvious pride. "Dean, everyone's talking about how well you've handled this entire situation. Cutting ties with Judy when you did, cooperating with the federal investigation. It was brilliant strategy." Rita Duran appeared at her husband's side, her expression more subdued. "I still can't believe that woman brought such shame to our family. Thank God you were smart enough to distance yourself before it was too late." Dean accepted their congratulations with appropriate humility, but his attention was drawn to a familiar figure standing alone near the windows overlooking the park. Stan Morton was there, looking uncomfortable in his best suit, holding a glass of champagne like a prop in a play he didn't understand. Dean approached the older man, who looked up with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "Mr. Duran, thank you for inviting me. I know I don't really belong here, but I wanted to express my appreciation for how you've handled everything." "You belong here more than anyone," Dean said sincerely. "You're the only person in this room who truly loved Judy unconditionally, despite everything she put you through." Stan's eyes filled with tears. "I still love her. Even after everything that's happened, she's still my daughter. But I don't understand how she became the person they described in that courtroom." Dean studied Stan's face, seeing the genuine confusion and heartbreak of a father trying to reconcile his love for his child with the reality of her actions. This was the moment Dean had been building toward, the convergence of all his carefully orchestrated revenge. "Mr. Morton, there's something I think you should know about Judy's character, something that might help you understand what happened." Over the next 20 minutes, Dean told Stan Morton the truth about his daughter. Not the criminal conspiracy. Stan already knew about that from the trial, but the pattern of shame and rejection that had defined Judy's relationship with her father since childhood. He told Stan about the law school graduation that Judy had asked him not to attend, about the years of borrowed money that she had never repaid, about the countless times she had lied about her father's profession, claiming he worked maintenance rather than admitting he cleaned toilets. Most painfully, Dean revealed the graduation party conversation, How Judy had asked her father to leave not out of concern for his comfort, but out of embarrassment about his presence. She was ashamed of you, Dean said gently. Not because of anything you did wrong, but because she couldn't reconcile loving you with wanting to be someone else. And that shame eventually grew into something darker, a willingness to betray anyone who threatened the image she was trying to create. Stan listened to this litany of rejection with the stoicism of a man who had always known the truth, but had never allowed himself to acknowledge it. When Dean finished, Stan was silent for a long moment. "I always knew," he said finally. "Deep down, I always knew she was ashamed of me. But I kept hoping that if I just loved her enough, if I just supported her dreams enough, she would eventually see that none of that other stuff mattered." "You did everything a father could do," Dean said. "The failure was hers, not yours." Stan nodded slowly, and Dean could see him finally accepting what he had spent years denying. Judy Morton Duran was not the devoted daughter he had imagined, but a woman whose ambition had poisoned her capacity for genuine love. "What happens now?" Stan asked. When she gets out of prison, will she come back to Chicago?" Dean considered the question carefully. "I don't think so. Chicago will always remind her of her failures, her humiliation. She'll probably start over somewhere else, try to reinvent herself again. And will you ever forgive her?" The question caught Dean off guard. In all his planning and manipulation, he had never considered the possibility of forgiveness. His revenge had been so complete, so perfectly executed, that forgiveness seemed irrelevant. "I don't know," Dean answered honestly. "I've learned that forgiveness isn't something you decide to do. It's something that either happens or doesn't. Right now, I'm focused on moving forward with my life." As the evening continued, Dean watched Stan Morton navigate the social gathering with quiet dignity. Several guests approached him with condolences and expressions of support, treating him like the victim he was rather than an embarrassment to be avoided. Arthur and Rita Duran, meanwhile, seemed to have undergone a remarkable transformation in their attitude towards Stan. The same couple who had mocked him as the toilet cleaner dad now spoke to him with respect and sympathy, apparently recognizing him as a fellow victim of Judy's deception. Dean observed this social rehabilitation with grim satisfaction. Stan Morton's story had captured the public's imagination. The hard-working father betrayed by his ungrateful daughter, and Chicago's elite were now eager to be seen supporting him. The irony was perfect. Judy's rejection of her father had ultimately elevated his status while destroying her own. The man she had been ashamed of was now seen as a tragic hero, while she was remembered as a criminal who had betrayed everyone who loved her. As the evening wound down, Dean found himself alone with Stan Morton on the terrace overlooking Lincoln Park. The older man stood at the railing, looking out at the same view that Arthur and Rita Duran had used to demonstrate their superiority just months earlier. "It's beautiful," Stan said quietly. "I can see why people would want to live like this." "Beauty is meaningless without character," Dean replied. "You have more character in your little finger than most of these people have in their entire bodies." Stan smiled sadly. "I used to think that success was about having nice things, living in beautiful places. That's why I wanted so much for Judy to have opportunities one never had. But I guess I never taught her that who you are matters more than what you have." "You taught her by example," Dean said. "The lesson she chose not to learn was her failure, not yours." As Stan Morton drove away in his old Honda Civic, Dean reflected on the completeness of his revenge. Gabriel Barrett was in federal prison, his career and reputation destroyed. Judy was serving her own prison sentence, stripped of everything she had valued: her status, her wealth, her place in Chicago society. Arthur and Rita Duran had been exposed as shallow, prejudiced people whose cruelty towards Stan Morton had been documented and publicized. Their social standing had survived, but their reputations would forever be tainted by their treatment of a decent man whose only crime was working honest jobs to support his daughter. And Dean himself had emerged as the victim, the principled attorney who had been betrayed by everyone he trusted, but had maintained his integrity throughout the ordeal. His practice was thriving, his reputation enhanced by his handling of the crisis. But as Dean stood alone on his parents' terrace, Looking out at the lights of Chicago, he felt something unexpected: emptiness. The revenge he had planned and executed with such precision had brought him no lasting satisfaction. The people who had wronged him were suffering, but their suffering had not healed the wounds they had inflicted. Judy was in prison, but Dean was still alone. Gabriel was ruined, but the betrayal of their partnership still stung. Arthur and Rita had been humiliated, but their cruelty toward Stan Morton had revealed something ugly about the world Dean inhabited. He had won his war, but victory felt hollow when there was no one left to share it with. His phone buzzed with a final text of the evening from Kelvin Riley. Stan Morton called. He wanted to thank you for everything you've done for him. Says you're the only person who treated him with real respect throughout this whole ordeal. Dean smiled bitterly as he read the message. Stan Morton's gratitude was genuine, but it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Dean hadn't treated Stan with respect out of kindness. He had done it as part of his revenge against Judy. Even his one genuinely decent act in this entire affair had been motivated by calculation rather than compassion. The trap had sprung perfectly, catching everyone Dean had intended to destroy. But in building his elaborate revenge, Dean had also constructed a prison for himself, one made of lies, manipulation, and the hollow satisfaction of victory without redemption. As he drove home to his empty mansion, Dean wondered if revenge was always this unsatisfying, or if he had simply chosen the wrong targets for his rage. Chapter 9. The Final Judgment. 1 year after Judy's conviction, Dean Duran sat in his corner office of the newly renamed Duran Legal Group, reviewing the morning's case files with the mechanical precision of a man going through familiar motions. His practice had never been more successful. Clients respected his principled handling of the Barrett scandal, and his reputation for integrity had grown considerably since his divorce. The Chicago Business Journal had named him Attorney of the Year for his ethical leadership during crisis. The Tribune had featured him in a story about resilience and redemption. Bar associations across the state invited him to speak about maintaining professional standards in the face of personal betrayal. Dean Duran was, by every external measure, a successful man who had overcome adversity with grace and principle. But success felt like ashes in his mouth. His phone rang, interrupting his brooding. Kelvin Riley's voice carried news that Dean had been expecting for weeks. Judy's being released next month. Early release for good behavior. She served 18 months of her 3-year sentence. Dean felt nothing, not satisfaction, not anxiety, just the familiar emptiness that had become his constant companion since his revenge had reached its conclusion. Where will she go? He asked. Phoenix, apparently. She's got a job lined up at a non-profit organization that helps ex-offenders reintegrate into society. Ironic considering. Dean almost smiled at that. Judy Morton, who had spent her life trying to escape her humble origins, would now be working with society's most vulnerable populations. It was fitting, in a way. She would finally understand what it meant to be looked down upon, to be judged by your worst moments rather than your best intentions. What about her father? Stan's been writing to her in prison. Regular letters, money for commissary, visits when the facility allows. The man never gave up on her, even after everything. This surprised Dean. Throughout Judy's trial and imprisonment, Stan Morton had maintained a dignified silence about his daughter's crimes. He had refused interview requests, avoided media attention, and simply continued his life with the quiet stoicism that had defined his character. Has she responded to his letters? Unknown, but I doubt it. Prison changes people, but it doesn't usually make them less selfish. After ending the call, Dean found himself thinking about Stan Morton for the first time in months. The older man had disappeared from public view after the trial, returning to his modest life and his night school classes. He had completed his degree and even started taking additional courses in social work, apparently inspired by his own experience with family dysfunction. Dean's intercom buzzed. Mr. Duran, there's a Stan Morton here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important. Dean felt his pulse quicken. Send him in. Stan Morton entered the office looking older, but somehow more settled than Dean remembered. His clothes were still modest, but well-maintained, his posture straighter than it had been during the dark days of the trial. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had survived his worst nightmare and emerged intact. "Mr. Duran, thank you for seeing me without an appointment." "Of course, Mr. Morton. Please sit down. What can I do for you?" Stan settled into the chair across from Dean's desk, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "I wanted to talk to you about Judy's release. I know you probably don't want to hear about her, but there are some things I think you should know." Dean leaned back in his chair, studying Stan's face. "I'm listening. She's been writing to me from prison. Not many letters, and they're not what you'd call warm. But she's been writing, and in her last letter, she asked me to reach out to you." This was unexpected. Dean had assumed that Judy would want nothing to do with her former life in Chicago, least of all contact with the husband who had divorced her while she faced criminal charges. "What did she want me to know?" Stan reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. "She asked me to give you this. Said it was important that you read it before she gets out." Dean stared at the envelope, his name written in Judy's familiar handwriting. After everything that had happened between them, she still wanted to communicate with him. The question was whether he wanted to hear what she had to say. "Why didn't she just mail it to me directly?" Stan's expression grew pained. "Because she knows you probably would have thrown it away without reading it. She thought if it came through me, you might at least consider her words." Dean took the envelope but didn't open it. "Mr. Morton, I want you to know that I harbor no ill will toward you. You were an innocent victim in all of this." "Was I?" Stan asked quietly. "I've had a lot of time to think about what happened, about the choices I made as a father. Maybe if I'd taught Judy different values, if I'd shown her that character mattered more than status." "You taught her by example," Dean interrupted. "The lessons she chose to ignore were her responsibility, not yours." Stan nodded, but Dean could see the self-doubt that still plagued him. "I keep wondering if I failed her somehow. If my own shame about our circumstances made her ashamed too." "Mr. Morton, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You worked honest jobs to provide for your daughter. You sacrificed your own comfort for her opportunities. You loved her unconditionally, even when she didn't deserve it. Any failure in her character was hers alone." They sat in silence for several minutes, two men who had been wounded by the same woman, each processing their own pain and regret. "Are you going to see her when she gets out?" Dean asked finally. "I don't know. Part of me wants to try to rebuild some kind of relationship with her. But another part of me wonders if it's time to let go, to accept that the daughter I raised is gone." Dean understood that struggle. For months after Judy's conviction, he had wrestled with his own feelings about their relationship. The woman he had married, or thought he had married, had never really existed. She had been a projection of his own desires, a carefully constructed image designed to win his love and support. "Have you read the letter?" Stan asked, gesturing toward the envelope in Dean's hands. "Not yet. She told me it was an apology. Said there were things she needed to say to you before she tried to start over." Dean turned the envelope over in his hands, feeling the weight of whatever words Judy had written. Part of him was curious about what she might say, what insights prison might have given her about their relationship and her choices. But another part of him feared that reading her words would reopen wounds that had finally begun to heal. "Mr. Morton, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you forgive her? After everything she put you through, all the shame and heartbreak, do you forgive her daughter?" Stan considered the question carefully, his eyes distant with memory and pain. "I forgive the little girl who was embarrassed by her circumstances and wanted something better. I forgive the young woman who thought she needed to choose between loving me and loving her new life. But the woman who looked me in the eye at that graduation party and told me to go home, I'm still working on forgiving her." Dean nodded, understanding the distinction. There were layers to forgiveness, different depths of wound that healed at different rates. "What about you?" Stan asked. "Do you forgive her?" Dean had been asking himself that question for months, ever since the trial had ended and his revenge had been complete. He had expected that destroying the people who betrayed him would bring closure, would heal the wounds they had inflicted. Instead, it had left him feeling empty and disconnected from the world around him. "I don't know," Dean answered honestly. "I understand why she made the choices she did. I even understand why she was ashamed of her origins. This world we live in values appearances over substance, status over character. But understanding someone's motivations doesn't mean excusing their actions. Stan stood to leave, pausing at the door to look back at Dean. Whatever's in that letter, whatever she says to you, remember that she's not the same person she was when all this started. Prison changes people, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, but always changes them. After Stan left, Dean sat alone in his office, staring at Judy's letter. The afternoon sun streamed through his windows, casting long shadows across his desk. Outside, Chicago hummed with its usual energy, but Dean felt disconnected from it all, isolated in his tower of success and righteousness. Finally, he opened the envelope and began to read. Dean, I know you have no reason to read this, and even less reason to believe anything I say. I know that my actions destroyed our marriage, hurt people I claim to love, and brought shame to everyone associated with me. I know that you have every right to hate me and never think about me again. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what I threw away when I chose Gabriel over our marriage. Not just the material things, the house, the status, the comfortable life you gave me. I threw away the love of a good man who deserved better than the woman I had become. I also want you to know that I understand what I did to my father. For years, I told myself that I was protecting him from a world he wouldn't understand, that my embarrassment about our different backgrounds was natural and harmless. But the truth is that I was ashamed of the man who gave me everything, and I let that shame poison our relationship. Prison has given me time to think about the person I became and the choices I made. I can't undo the damage I caused, and I can't become the woman you married again, because that woman was partly an illusion, a performance designed to win your love without earning it. But I want you to know that I remember who you are, a man of principle and integrity who treated my father with more respect than I ever did. A man who built a life based on honesty and hard work, not manipulation and deception. A man who deserved a wife who would honor those values instead of betraying them. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I'm not asking for another chance because I squandered the one I had. I'm simply asking that you remember that our marriage wasn't entirely built on lies. My love for you is real, even if I didn't know how to show it properly. My gratitude for the life you gave me was genuine, even if I didn't appreciate it until I lost it. I hope you find happiness with someone who deserves the man you are. I hope you don't let my betrayal make you cynical about love or marriage. And I hope that someday, when enough time has passed, you can think about our good times without the shadow of how badly it all ended. Take care of yourself, Dean. You deserve every happiness that life can offer. Judy. Dean set the letter down and stared out his office window at the Chicago skyline. The words were carefully chosen, remorseful in tone, but ultimately self-serving. Even in her apology, Judy was trying to manipulate him, seeking absolution for her conscience rather than offering genuine accountability. She spoke of understanding her mistakes, but her letter revealed that she still didn't truly comprehend the depth of her betrayal. She framed her actions as errors in judgment rather than fundamental character flaws. She painted herself as a woman who had lost her way rather than someone who had methodically chosen selfishness over loyalty at every crucial moment. Dean's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Judy. I'm being released tomorrow. Dad said he gave you my letter. I hope we can talk sometime. Dean stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. Some betrayals cut too deep to heal. The next morning brought news that Gabriel Barrett had been found dead in his federal prison cell, an apparent suicide. The man who had seemed so powerful and sophisticated had ultimately proven to be weak when faced with the consequences of his actions. Dean felt no satisfaction in Gabriel's death, only a grim confirmation that some people crumble when their carefully constructed facades are stripped away. 2 weeks later, Dean received a call from Kelvin Riley with an update on Judy's situation in Phoenix. She's struggling, Kelvin reported. The nonprofit job fell through when they discovered her criminal background. She's working at a call center now, living in a studio apartment in a rough neighborhood. Apparently, she tried to contact some of her old friends from Chicago, but nobody wants anything to do with her. And her father? Stan drove down to Phoenix last weekend. They met for coffee. From what I could observe, it didn't go well. Judy seemed to expect some kind of grand reconciliation, but Stan kept his distance. He was polite, but cold. He's finally accepted what his daughter really is. Dean nodded, feeling a sense of completion. Stan Morton had been the final piece of unfinished business, the last person who might have offered Judy unearned redemption. But even her father's unconditional love had limits, and Judy had finally exceeded them. That evening, Dean attended a charity gala at the Four Seasons, the same hotel where he had once discovered evidence of Judy's affair. The irony wasn't lost on him as he moved through the crowd of Chicago's elite, accepting congratulations on his professional success and expressions of sympathy for his personal trials. Dean, Arthur Duran approached with a distinguished-looking woman in her 50s. I'd like you to meet Elizabeth Beard. She's the new managing partner at Whitman and Associates. Elizabeth Beard was attractive in an understated way. Intelligent eyes, professional bearing, the confidence that came from building a successful career through merit rather than manipulation. As they talked, Dean found himself genuinely interested in her perspectives on law practice and professional ethics. I've followed your handling of the Barrett situation, Elizabeth said. It can't have been easy, maintaining your integrity while your personal and professional worlds collapsed around you. Sometimes doing the right thing is the only choice that lets you sleep at night, Dean replied. Later, as the evening wound down, Elizabeth approached him again. Would you be interested in having dinner sometime? I'd love to continue our conversation about building ethical practices in a competitive market. Dean studied her face, seeing genuine interest rather than calculation. Elizabeth Beard was successful in her own right, had built her own reputation, needed nothing from him except good conversation and possibly companionship. I'd like that, he said, and meant it. As he drove home that night, Dean reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. The revenge he had orchestrated had been perfectly executed, every enemy destroyed, every betrayal punished. But the satisfaction he had expected from victory had never materialized. Instead, he had learned that justice and fulfillment were different things entirely. Judy was learning to live with the consequences of her choices, working in obscurity and facing the daily reality of a life stripped of privilege and status. Gabriel Barrett was dead, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about corruption and excess. Arthur and Rita Duran had been exposed as shallow and cruel, their reputations permanently tainted despite their wealth and connections. Dean had won completely, but victory had taught him something unexpected. Some wounds never heal, no matter how thoroughly you punish those who inflicted them. Revenge was a dish best served cold, but it was also a meal that left you eternally hungry. His phone rang as he pulled into his driveway. Stan Morton's name appeared on the screen. Mr. Duran, I hope I'm not calling too late. Not at all, Mr. Morton. How can I help you? I wanted to thank you for everything you've done, and I wanted you to know that I saw Judy last week in Phoenix. Dean waited, letting Stan find his words. She asked about you. Want to know if you might ever consider. I told her that some things can't be undone, some trust can't be rebuilt. I think she finally understands that. How are you doing with all of this? Stan's voice was steady when he answered. I'm learning to grieve for the daughter I thought I had while accepting the woman she actually became. It's not easy, but it's necessary. And what happens now? Now I focus on my own life. I'm starting a new job next month, counseling work with at-risk youth. Maybe I can help other kids avoid the mistakes Judy made. Dean smiled at this news. Stan Morton, the man everyone had dismissed and humiliated, was transforming his pain into purpose. He was choosing to build something positive from the wreckage of his relationship with his daughter. That sounds like meaningful work. It is. And Dean, I know what you did for me during all this. The way you treated me with respect when others didn't, the way you made sure my side of the story was heard. I may not understand all the details of what happened between you and Judy, but I know you showed me more kindness than I had any right to expect. After ending the call, Dean sat in his car for several minutes, processing Stan's words. The older man's gratitude was genuine, but it was based on an incomplete understanding of Dean's motivations. Stan didn't know that Dean's kindness had been strategic, part of a larger plan to destroy Judy's reputation and relationships. But perhaps that didn't matter. Perhaps the effect of an action was more important than its motivation. Stan Morton had been treated with dignity during his darkest hour, and that dignity had helped him rebuild his sense of self-worth. The fact that Dean's kindness had been calculated didn't make its impact less real. Dean's final act of revenge came not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a quiet decision. He never responded to Judy's attempts at contact, never acknowledged her letters or phone calls. He moved forward with his life as if she had never existed, erasing her from his world as completely as she had once tried to erase her father. 6 months later, the Chicago Tribune ran a story about Dean's engagement to Elizabeth Beard. The article portrayed it as a love story born from shared professional values and mutual respect. Two successful attorneys who had found partnership built on equality rather than dependence. The announcement included a quote from Dean that captured his philosophy perfectly. "I've learned that real love is based on who someone is, not who they pretend to be. Elizabeth and I share the same values, the same commitment to integrity. That's the foundation for a marriage that can weather any storm." The article made no mention of his previous marriage. Judy Duran had been erased from his official history, reduced to a cautionary tale that he occasionally shared with trusted friends about the importance of truly knowing someone before committing your life to them. 3 years after Judy's conviction, Dean Duran stood at the altar of Chicago's Fourth Presbyterian Church, watching Elizabeth Beard walk down the aisle in an elegant but understated wedding dress. The guest list included Stan Morton, who had become an unexpected friend and regular dinner companion. The older man had found peace in his counseling work and had built a new life centered on helping others rather than seeking validation from his ungrateful daughter. As Elizabeth reached the altar, Dean felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine happiness untainted by calculation or manipulation. This woman loved him for who he actually was, not for what he could provide. She had her own career, her own reputation, her own reasons for existing beyond their relationship. During their vows, Elizabeth spoke about building a marriage based on truth and mutual respect. "I promise to see you clearly," she said, "not as I wish you were, but as you actually are. And I promise to love that real person with all his strengths and flaws." Dean's own vows reflected the lessons he had learned from his first marriage's destruction. "I promise to earn your trust every day, not to assume it as my right. I promise to value your character over your accomplishments, your loyalty over your status. And I promise to be worthy of the love you're offering me." As they exchanged rings, Dean caught sight of Stan Morton in the front row, tears streaming down his weathered face. The older man was crying not from sadness, but from joy, witnessing love that was built on solid ground rather than shifting sand. The reception was held at the Union League Club, and Dean gave a toast that spoke to his journey from betrayal to redemption. "I've learned that some people come into our lives to teach us what love looks like, while others teach us what it doesn't. Elizabeth has shown me that real partnership means choosing each other every day, not just in the easy moments, but in the difficult ones too." Later that evening, as he and Elizabeth danced their first dance as husband and wife, Dean's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I saw the announcement in the Tribune. I'm happy for you. You deserve love that's real. Jay." Dean showed the message to Elizabeth, who read it with interest rather than jealousy. "Your ex-wife?" she asked. "Yes. Are you going to respond?" Dean deleted the message without a second thought. "No, that chapter of my life is closed." Elizabeth nodded with understanding. She knew the broad strokes of Dean's first marriage and divorce, knew about the betrayal and criminal conviction that had ended it. But she also knew that Dean had moved beyond bitterness into something healthier. Not forgiveness exactly, but indifference. As they continued dancing, Dean reflected on the completeness of his victory. Judy was living in poverty and obscurity, working menial jobs, and facing daily reminders of how far she had fallen. Gabriel Barrett was dead, his legacy one of crime and disgrace. Arthur and Rita Duran had been humbled by their public exposure as cruel and shallow people. But the real victory wasn't their destruction. It was Dean's ability to build something better from the ashes of what they had destroyed. He had found love based on truth rather than deception, partnership built on equality rather than dependence. He had learned to value character over status, integrity over appearance. The revenge was complete, but it no longer mattered. Dean Duran had won by refusing to let his enemy's betrayal define his future. He had chosen to build rather than simply destroy, to grow rather than simply punish. And in that choice, he had found something more valuable than revenge. He had found peace. The last dance of the evening was a slow waltz, and as Dean held Elizabeth in his arms, he felt the final pieces of his old pain dissolving into something like gratitude. Judy's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been necessary, stripping away his illusions and forcing him to confront the difference between love and manipulation, between loyalty and convenience. Stan Morton caught Dean's eye from across the dance floor and raised a champagne glass in a quiet toast. The gesture was one of mutual understanding between two men who had been betrayed by the same woman, but had chosen different paths forward. Stan had chosen forgiveness and service to others. Dean had chosen justice and careful reconstruction of his life. Both paths were valid. Both had led to peace. As the evening ended and the guests departed, Dean and Elizabeth stood together on the club's terrace, looking out at the lights of Chicago. The city spread before them like a promise of future possibilities, untainted by the shadows of past betrayals. "No regrets?" Elizabeth asked, taking his hand. Dean considered the question carefully. He thought about Judy, probably asleep in her small apartment in Phoenix, alone with the consequences of her choices. He thought about Gabriel Barrett, whose grave in a pauper's cemetery bore no flowers or remembrances. He thought about his parents, who had learned too late the cost of their cruelty and prejudice. "No regrets," he said finally. "Everything that happened led me to you. Even the worst betrayals served a purpose in the end." Elizabeth squeezed his hand, understanding that some stories could only be told in retrospect, when all the pieces had fallen into place and the pattern finally became clear. Dean Duran had been betrayed by everyone he trusted most. In response, he had orchestrated their complete destruction with the precision of a master strategist and the patience of a man who understood that justice delayed was not justice denied. But his greatest victory was not in their punishment. It was in his refusal to let their betrayal poison his capacity for trust and love. He had emerged from the wreckage of his first marriage stronger, wiser, and more discerning. He had learned to see people clearly, to value substance over appearance, to build relationships on solid foundations rather than shifting sand. The price of betrayal, Dean had learned, was not just the destruction of trust. It was the revelation of character. Judy had revealed herself to be weak and selfish. Gabriel had shown himself to be predatory and corrupt. Arthur and Rita had exposed their cruelty and prejudice. But Dean had revealed something else entirely, that a man of true character could be wounded but not broken, betrayed but not defeated. He had proven that justice, patience, and strategic thinking could overcome any betrayal. As he and Elizabeth left the club together, beginning their new life as husband and wife, Dean felt the satisfaction of a man who had played a long game and won completely. His enemies were destroyed, his reputation enhanced, his future secured with a woman worthy of his trust. The toilet cleaner's daughter who had been ashamed of her origins was now cleaning other people's messes for minimum wage. The sophisticated attorney who had preyed on vulnerable women was dead and forgotten. The wealthy couple who had mocked honest work were social pariahs whose cruelty had been exposed for all to see. Dean Duran had won everything that mattered, and he had done it without compromising his principles or abandoning his integrity. He had proven that in the end, character was the only currency that truly mattered. The price of betrayal had been paid in full, and Dean Duran had collected every cent with interest. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.